A terrifying storm strikes, swallowing an entire town in its ruthless floodwaters. A man is forced to leave, abandoning his most loyal companion, a dog willing to sacrifice everything just to stay by his side. But will fate give them a chance to reunite? This is not just a survival story. It's a powerful testament to loyalty, unconditional love, and the extraordinary resilience between humans and animals. Make sure to watch until the very end, because this story will touch your heart like never before. Don't forget to subscribe to Dog Stories so you never miss an emotional tale about our incredible four-legged friends. Now let's dive into this gripping story. The sky over Clearwater, Texas, was swallowed in a thick blanket of gray, with dark storm clouds swirling like a massive tidal wave, ready to consume the small town below. The air was heavy, eerily silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath before an unprecedented storm. David Thompson stood on his porch, squinting toward the horizon. The wind grew stronger with each passing minute, carrying the damp scent of an impending storm. He clenched his fists, feeling an unease creeping through every gust of wind sweeping across the empty fields surrounding his ranch. Beside him, Ranger, his German shepherd, stood alert, ears perked. Though no words were spoken, both knew something was terribly wrong. Ranger wasn't just a dog, he was family, the only companion David had after years of service in the military. When he returned to Clearwater after his deployment, he carried with him the unshakable memories of war, of fallen brothers in arms. If it weren't for Ranger, he wasn't sure he would have made it through. Ranger was his anchor, and to Ranger, David was his whole world. Then, the first crack of thunder rumbled across the sky. This is a Category 4 hurricane moving faster than expected. All residents must evacuate immediately. The urgent voice crackled through the radio. David turned to Ranger. The dog looked back at him, his dark eyes filled with a silent worry, a kind of understanding that only those who had spent years with a dog could recognize. "It's gonna be okay, buddy," David murmured, giving Ranger a reassuring pat on the head. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The first raindrops pounded against the roof, heavy and relentless. Within minutes, the backyard was already filling with water. David couldn't waste any more time. They had to leave. Now. He grabbed the essentials, threw them into a bag, and yanked open the truck door. Ranger followed closely, his sleek black fur already drenched under the torrential downpour. But just as David reached for the driver's seat, a violent gust of wind howled through the air, carrying a massive tree crashing down right in front of the ranch's exit. Thud, their only way out, completely blocked. David froze for a moment, his mind racing. Then, instinct took over. He jumped into the truck, shifted into reverse, and tried to find another way out. But the tires only spun uselessly in the thick, muddy ground. They were stuck. David gritted his teeth, slamming his fists against the steering wheel. No way. They couldn't be trapped here. He turned to Ranger, who stood by his side, unwavering, his eyes filled with trust. No, he wouldn't give up. David threw the truck door open and ran into the storm, rain pounding against his skin as water rose to his ankles. He had to find another way. If they couldn't escape by truck, maybe he could get Ranger over the back fence. But then, "David, you have to leave now," a voice shouted through the downpour. Logan Carter, a rescue worker, was sprinting toward him, pushing a small rescue boat through the rising flood. "The road's blocked. I have to get Ranger over the fence." "David," yelled, but Logan cut him off. "There's no time. The water's rising too fast. You have to go now." David spun around. The flood had already climbed to his calves, and the current was growing stronger. Ranger clawed at his leg, pulling at him, as if begging him not to leave. No, he couldn't abandon him. But Logan grabbed David's arm, yanking him toward the boat. "You'll die if you stay. We'll come back for the dog. Promise me, David." Everything spun in a blur. David fought to break free, but the force pulled him away, tearing him from the ground, from the one thing he couldn't leave behind. The last thing he saw, Ranger, standing in the rain, his eyes locked onto him, confused, not understanding why David was leaving him. A searing pain ripped through David's chest, a deep, overwhelming horror taking over. He screamed into the storm, I'll come back, I promise. But then the flood swallowed everything, and Ranger disappeared from sight. The storm struck. The sky tore open, lightning slashed across the heavens, briefly illuminating the chaotic scene below. Rain poured down like sharp, icy daggers, pounding the earth and forming streams that cascaded down the streets in powerful torrents. The wind howled with madness, tearing through rows of trees that were no longer able to stand firm. Branches were shredded, metal roofs were ripped away, and signs snapped, slamming into walls with a series of ear-splitting crashes. The air was filled with the relentless symphony of howling wind and screaming rain. Floodwaters rose rapidly, swallowing entire streets, entire corners of homes, erasing any trace of the familiar roads that once led through the town. Vehicles were swept away like toys, spinning helplessly in the swirling current. Alarms blared endlessly, but no one could hear one another anymore. Only pure chaos remained. David fights to get back to the ranch. While everyone else was fleeing, David was driving straight into the storm. Rain slammed against his windshield. The wind howled like a beast, shaking the truck as it skidded on the waterlogged road. He gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, wrestling to keep control. Come on. Come on. He gritted through clenched teeth, eyes locked on the road ahead. Floodwaters had already risen to knee level, surging like a wild, untamed river, but he couldn't stop now. Then, boom! A small bridge ahead collapsed, leaving a gaping void in its place. The river raged below, swallowing pieces of broken asphalt and debris, pulling them under like an unstoppable force. David tightened his grip on the wheel, scanning frantically for another way through. There was none. To the west, the detour had turned into a lake, abandoned cars half submerged in the rising waters. To the east, a massive oak tree had been uprooted, blocking the entire road. He was trapped. David slammed his fist against the wheel, his chest tightening with frustration. No, he couldn't go back to the evacuation center. Ranger was still out there. But there was no other choice. If he kept pushing forward, he'd be the next one swallowed by the flood. Gritting his teeth, David threw the truck into reverse, the rising water lapping at the tires, small waves crashing against the doors. He pounded the dashboard, anger burning in his chest, at himself, at the storm, at everything. But deep inside, he made a silent promise. As soon as the sun rises, I'll come back. I'm not leaving you behind, Ranger. At the ranch, Ranger waits. Then disaster strikes. Ranger stood under the porch, his ears perked, eyes wide. Something wasn't right. The wind howled through the cracks in the doors, rattling the wooden panels. Rain hammered against the roof, and water had already begun pooling on the porch, running in streams beneath his paws. David was gone. Ranger didn't understand why his owner hadn't come back, but he waited. He hoped. Then, crack. A fence panel splintered apart, ripped from the posts and slammed onto the ground by the howling wind. At that same moment, a massive wave of floodwater surged through the backyard, crashing into the ranch like a monstrous force, swallowing everything in its path. Ranger jumped back, startled, but it was too late. Water rushed in, icy and unforgiving, sweeping away trash cans, wooden planks, and anything in its way. Ranger tried to leap onto the porch steps, but another wave slammed into him, from the side, pulling him under, swept away, cold darkness. Ranger tumbled through the raging current, his body going numb. For the first time in his life, he didn't know where he was. The water spun him around, dragging him down, then shoving him back up. His ears rang, his lungs tightened as he struggled to gasp for air between the relentless waves crashing over him. He kicked, fought, paddled against the flood, but the current was 100 times stronger. Thud! His body slammed into something solid, a massive floating log. Desperately, he clawed at its slick surface, gripping it with everything he had, fighting to keep himself from being dragged farther away. Now, there was nothing left. No ranch, no ground. Beneath his paws, just water, wind, and darkness. But he wouldn't give up. He couldn't. Somewhere out there, David was waiting, and Ranger had to survive. Ranger's body was swallowed by the raging flood, the violent currents ripping the breath from his lungs. Darkness closed in, and all he could hear was the deafening roar of water. He thrashed wildly, sharp claws scraping at nothing, searching, desperately for something, anything to hold on to. He kicked, struggled, fought to push himself back to the surface, but every time he nearly broke through, another wave crashed down, shoving him deeper into the abyss. Water flooded his nose, his mouth choking him. He coughed, gagged, spun helplessly in the churning vortex. Up, down, sideways. He no longer knew which way led to air. Thud, something slammed into his side, sending a sharp pain through his ribs. He yelped, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. His body was tossed like a rag doll, caught in the flood's merciless grip. The current dragged him farther and farther away. He tried to swim. He had to swim. But his legs were losing strength. The freezing water sank into his muscles, draining the last of his energy. His vision blurred. His head spun. Maybe he couldn't win against this flood. A memory of David. Then, in the darkness of the rushing water, a face appeared in his mind. David, his owner. The man it had always trusted, the one who had always been by its side, the one it would never abandon. His deep, warm laughter echoed in its memory. "You're the best dog, Ranger." David's hand reaching out, gently ruffling its fur, his eyes filled with love. The times they ran across the open fields, the afternoons spent lying on the porch, listening to the wind rustling through the dry grass. And then the last words, "I'll come back. I promise." Boom! Another massive wave slammed into Ranger, but this time it didn't surrender. It summoned every ounce of strength left, kicked hard, and forced itself upward toward the surface. It couldn't let David down. It had to survive. Ranger gasped for air, lifting its head just as a lightning bolt split the sky apart. In the blinding white flash, it saw something large drifting toward it, a wooden beam from a collapsed roof. This was its only chance. It lunged forward, stretching, with all its might toward the floating wood, still too far. It clenched its jaw, pushed through the screaming pain in its muscles, the water rising past its face. Thud! It slammed into the wood, front paws latching onto the edge, claws digging into the slippery surface. But the relentless water refused to let go. The beam tilted, threatening to toss it back into the flood. No! With every last ounce of strength, Ranger tensed its muscles, digging its claws deeper into the wood, pulling half of its body up onto the surface. It gasped for air, chest rising and falling rapidly, heart pounding against its ribs as it tried to steady its breath. It had made it. It wasn't dead, but the fight wasn't over. The current kept surging forward, sweeping the wooden beam farther and farther away, dragging Ranger away from the ranch, away from everything it knew. It looked around. Nothing was left. The ranch was gone. The road was gone. Its entire world had been replaced by an endless sea of raging water. For the first time, it was completely alone. But Ranger didn't whimper. It didn't cry. It was still alive, and as long as it could breathe, it would not give up. Somewhere out there, David was looking for it, and it would find its way back. David couldn't sit still. Rain poured down in sheets. Wind ripped doors from their hinges, sent rooftops flying, but none of it mattered. All he could think about was Ranger. His dog was still out there, alone in the storm. He had made a promise. "I'll come back." And he wasn't going to break that promise. Inside the evacuation center, chaos consumed everything. People huddled in corners, some crying quietly, others speaking in panicked tones. Rescue workers rushed back and forth, trying to maintain order, updating the crowd on which areas were completely submerged. David didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward Logan Carter, the man who had pulled him away from the ranch earlier. "I have to go back." His voice was firm, unwavering. Logan looked up at him, his expression dead serious. "That's not possible, David. You've seen the situation. The roads are gone. The floodwaters are still rising. We're doing everything we can to find missing people, but no one is allowed back in." David gritted his teeth. "I'm not looking for people. I'm looking for my dog." Logan sighed, trying to stay calm. "I get it. I really do. But if you go back, you won't make it. We've already lost contact with 2 rescue teams that tried reaching that area. What do you think you can do? David's fist clenched at his sides. He's not just a dog. He's my family. A brief silence. Logan studied him carefully, but in the end he shook his head. I can't let you do this. David didn't wait. Without another word, he slipped through the crowd, making his way toward the parking lot. His truck was still there, coated in mud, but it could still run. He climbed in, turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, its growl drowned out by the relentless rain. David slammed his foot on the gas and the truck charged into the stormy night. The road back to the ranch. Hell in the flood. The town was unrecognizable. The streets were completely submerged, the ground no longer visible beneath the water. Traffic signs floated aimlessly. Cars overturned, smashed into walls, tossed aside like abandoned toys. Boom! A small bridge collapsed right in front of him, sending another vehicle plunging into the raging flood below. David yanked the wheel hard, the truck skidding sideways, nearly spinning out of control. But he didn't stop. Lives left behind. As he drove past a nearby farm, his heart clenched at the sight before him. A herd of cattle stood huddled together on a shrinking patch of dry land, water rising around their legs. A panicked horse thrashed against its stall, its stable slowly being swallowed by the flood, and in the middle of the chaos, a small dog had been left behind on a porch, barking frantically, begging for someone to save it. David gritted his teeth, his chest tightening. He wanted to save them all, but right now, he had to find Ranger first. When David reached the area near his ranch, the flood had swallowed everything. He jumped out of the truck, his boots sinking into the mud, rain lashing against his face like whips. "Ranger!" he shouted. But no answer came. Only the howling wind, the relentless roar of floodwaters smashing against collapsed buildings. David felt his chest tighten, his heart sinking. No. Don't tell me I'm too late. But then, a bark. Faint. Far away. Through the dark, raging river, something was floating. David squinted, straining to see through the storm. Then, his heart nearly leaped out of his chest. Ranger. Clinging desperately to a large wooden plank, his eyes scanning the flood, searching for something. David didn't think. He ran. He dove into the flood. No hesitation. No time for fear. No second thoughts. Ranger was right there, trapped in the raging current, and he couldn't let him disappear. Splash! The freezing water swallowed him whole the moment he hit. The current seized him immediately, pulling, twisting, dragging him downward into the abyss. It felt like 100 invisible hands were gripping him, trying to drag him deeper, wrapping around him, forcing him into the darkness. But he wouldn't let it happen. David kicked hard, breaking through the surface, gasping for air. Rain slammed into his face, wind sliced through the storm, turning every raindrop into tiny needles of ice. He whipped his head around, scanning the water. And then, he saw him. About 15 meters away, Ranger was struggling, his legs kicking furiously to keep himself afloat. He was trying to swim toward David, even as the current dragged him farther away. "Ranger!" David yelled, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. Ranger saw him too. Even as the flood spun him in circles, his eyes lit up with hope. David pushed forward, his arms slicing through the freezing water, but he couldn't outswim the flood. The current was too strong. Every time he stretched forward, the waves shoved him backward. His arms ached, his muscles burned, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Ranger paddled with everything he had, but for every inch he gained, the river yanked him 2 steps back. He didn't whimper, didn't panic. He just kept swimming. David felt his chest tighten. He's not giving up, so I can't give up either. He reached out closer, closer. Boom! Suddenly, a massive tree trunk crashed down from upstream, hurtling toward them like a giant spear. David's eyes widened in horror. Without thinking, he dove underwater just before it could slam into him. Darkness swallowed him whole. All he could hear was the roaring in his ears, the thunder of his own heartbeat. He kicked upward, desperate to break the surface. but the current had already pushed him farther away from Ranger. David opened his eyes, his lungs burning for air. No! He couldn't lose Ranger now. With every ounce of strength left, he kicked hard, forcing himself back to the surface. Immediately, his eyes searched for Ranger. And then, he was right there, just an arm's length away. David lunged forward. Splash! He caught him. His fingers clenched onto Ranger's soaked fur, pulling him in. Ranger gasped for air, panting, but his tail wagged slightly. He knew David was here. David held him close, feeling the frantic pounding of his heartbeat against his chest. They had found each other. But they weren't safe yet. The raging waters refused to let go. David tried to keep Ranger afloat, but the current was dragging them into unknown territory. No trees, no rooftops, just water and floating debris. David whipped his head around, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. Crash! A massive wave surged forward, pulling them into an even stronger current. David was thrown backward, but he never let go of Ranger. The two of them spun uncontrollably in the raging current, completely powerless against the river's pull. Up ahead, a collapsed structure appeared, an old warehouse half submerged, its roof caved in, jagged metal beams jutting out like deadly spikes. David's eyes widened in horror. They were being dragged straight toward it. If they didn't change direction, they would be slammed into the wreckage. David frantically scanned his surroundings, searching for anything that could help. To the right, a large metal barrel floated toward them. David clutched Ranger tightly, braced himself, and kicked off the barrel with all his strength, using it as leverage. Splash! The force was enough to push them away from the warehouse, but in return, David lost his grip on Ranger. Ranger let out a sharp bark, desperately trying to swim back toward him. But the current had already torn them apart again. David felt himself falling then. Thud! His body slammed into a floating wooden plank, pain exploding through his ribs. His vision blurred. The flood kept roaring, relentless, deafening. Somewhere nearby, Ranger was barking wildly, but David's ears were ringing, the sound fading into the storm. His body drifted, his consciousness slipping. No, he couldn't give up now. He had found Ranger. He had to survive. With the last bit of strength he had left, David reached out, searching for anything to hold on to, anything to keep him from sinking. Crash! Cold. Exhausted. The water kept surging, relentless. David struggled to keep his head above the surface, his body heavy as lead, every joint screaming in pain from the brutal impacts earlier. But he couldn't stop now. Right beside him, Ranger was still fighting, his legs paddling furiously to stay afloat. Despite the exhaustion, his eyes still burned with determination, as if telling him, "We're not giving up." David squinted through the blinding rain. Up ahead, a half-submerged truck was wedged against a massive log in the raging current. Their only chance. Ignoring the pain, David pushed forward, swimming with everything he had toward the truck. Ranger followed, but the waves kept shoving them back, refusing to let them reach safety. 5 meters. 3 meters. The water's pull intensified, the rain pounded harder, turning the world into a blurry, chaotic mess. David gritted his teeth, forced every muscle to move, and lunged forward, his fingers gripping the truck's side mirror. The freezing metal under his hand told him one thing: they still had a chance. "Ranger, come on!" Ranger kicked harder, trying to close the distance, but the current was too strong, dragging him farther away. "No!" With every ounce of strength left, David let go with one hand, lunging out just as Ranger was about to be swallowed by the flood. His fingers clamped onto Ranger's collar. With one desperate pull, he hauled him toward the truck. Ranger clawed at the wet metal, his paws scrambling for grip against the slippery fender. Splash! A massive wave crashed into them, nearly ripping them both back into the flood, but David held on tight, refusing to let go. With one final pull, he hauled Ranger onto the hood of the truck. Both of them gasped for breath, their chests rising and falling heavily in the pouring rain. They had made it, but the nightmare wasn't Over. The truck begins to drift. David tried to steady himself, but as soon as he lifted his head, a sinking feeling rushed through him. The truck was moving. No, that couldn't be, but it was. The floodwaters kept rising, and the large log that had held the truck in place was gone, swept away by the current. Now nothing was stopping it from drifting deeper into the flood. David pressed his lips together, scanning his surroundings. They had to get off before it was too late. Ranger senses David's weakness. David could feel it now, his body slowing down. Every pull, every movement felt heavier. Each breath burned in his chest. He had lost too much strength. But Ranger realized it before he did. Despite his own exhaustion, Ranger moved closer, his body pressed protectively against David, as if trying to shield him from the danger ahead. David let out a tired chuckle, reaching out to gently run his fingers over Ranger's soaked fur. "You're still not giving up, huh?" he panted. Ranger wouldn't quit, and neither would he. David lifted his head, his eyes scanning desperately for anything that could save them. About 10 meters away, an old water tower stood firm in the raging flood. The steel beams were still intact, but the water level was rising fast, which meant they only had minutes before it would be completely submerged. David gritted his teeth. This was their last chance. He turned to Ranger. "Listen, buddy, I'm throwing you first. You have to hold on, got it?" Ranger locked eyes with him, his gaze filled with complete trust. David took a deep breath, summoned every last ounce of strength, and lifted Ranger, aiming for a steel beam jutting out near the base of the tower. Splash! He launched him across the water. Ranger soared through the air, his body twisting mid-flight between the wind and rain. He made it! Ranger's claws dug into the metal beam, scraping against the slick surface, desperately holding on. He turned back, barking loudly, as if urging David to follow. But the truck had already drifted too far. David had only seconds before he was pulled under again. No more options. He jumped. Crash! His body slammed into the tower, pain exploding through his ribs, but with one final stretch, his fingers clamped onto the steel beam. David's fingers clenched tight, every muscle screaming in agony. But he was alive. He hauled himself up, gripping the steel beam with everything he had, gasping for air. Ranger was already there, waiting for him, even though his body trembled. From exhaustion, they had found a temporary safe place, but the water was still rising. They weren't out of danger yet. The storm raged on. Rain poured down like a waterfall. The wind howled, sending waves slamming against the water tower, shaking the fragile refuge where David and Ranger clung to survival. David gripped the freezing metal, his body battered and drained, but his mind stayed sharp, locked onto one single goal: survive with Ranger. Ranger lay low against the beam, his breathing heavy, drenched fur clinging to his body, but his eyes stayed alert, tracking every movement in the violent flood below. They had climbed higher, but the water wasn't stopping. The storm wasn't done yet. David lifted his gaze, scanning the surroundings for anything higher, any chance to escape the flood tightening around them like a monstrous grip. Then, he saw it. A 2-story building, standing about 15 meters away, still holding against the storm. If they could make it there, they might actually have a real shot at surviving. David turned to Ranger, running his fingers gently through his soaked fur. "We have to jump, buddy." Ranger lifted his head, looking at him. No hesitation, no fear, only absolute trust. David nodded, bracing himself. But then, boom, the building collapses. A thunderous explosion erupted from somewhere in town. David whipped his head around, his eyes widening in horror. The building they were aiming for, it was coming down. In an instant, the entire structure of concrete and steel crumbled, collapsing like a massive beast snapping in half, sending a monstrous wave surging across the floodwaters. David froze, gripping the metal beam tighter. But the wave wouldn't spare them. Crash! A wall of water slammed into them like a freight train, ripping them from their perch. David felt his body hurl through the air, the world spinning out of control. He was being swept away. David gets injured. Thud. David's body collided with something solid, a floating steel beam. His head slammed into the metal with full force, and then everything went dark. The sounds disappeared. Pain shot through David's skull, his body losing all strength. Water rushed into his mouth. His body sank. His consciousness faded. Ranger fights for his owner. Ranger barked wildly, panic blazing in his eyes. David was sinking. The current was, pulling him away, dragging him deeper into the darkness. But Ranger refused to accept that. With every ounce of strength left in his aching muscles, he swam like an arrow, cutting through the water, chasing after David as he disappeared below. Ranger lunged forward, clamping his jaws around David's collar. He pulled, hard, but David didn't move. No, no, Ranger snarled against the water, his legs kicking furiously, ripping his owner away from the jaws of death. Splash! They burst through the surface. Ranger kept David's head above water, his legs barely able to move anymore. But he didn't. Let go. He would never let go. David regains consciousness. The storm raged on. Rain pounded against their faces, relentless. David coughed violently, a surge of water spilling from his mouth. Like a shock to his system, his consciousness snapped back. The moment he opened his eyes, he saw Ranger gripping his collar, holding his head above water. David felt the dog's hot breath against his skin, felt the unwavering strength of the creature who had fought through everything to keep him from drowning. Ranger had saved him. David blinked, forcing his mind to focus, and reached out, pulling Ranger into a tight embrace. Good boy. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but his eyes burned with gratitude. Ranger still didn't let go. Instead, he let out a soft whimper, as if making sure David was really alive. But before they could even catch their breath, boom! A power line snapped, crashing into the flood nearby, sending a deadly surge of electricity crackling across the water. David snapped his head up, his breath catching in his throat. They had to move. Now, but they were drained. Ranger scratched weakly at David's hand, as if asking, "What now?" David swallowed hard, scanning their surroundings. They had survived everything so far, but if they didn't find safety now, it would all be for nothing. David sucked in a deep breath. The freezing air stabbed his lungs like knives, each inhale burning through his chest. His head spun, the wound on his forehead dripping blood, but there was no time to focus on pain. They couldn't stay here any longer. The storm wasn't over. The floodwaters were still rising, and right in front of him, a broken power line teetered dangerously, leaning closer and closer toward the raging current. Zzzzt, zzzt, sparks exploded, crackling over the soaked metal, dancing like wild flames along the wires. If it touched the water, the entire area would become a death trap. David swallowed hard, his eyes darting quickly around for an escape. No time. Only one chance. About 10 meters ahead, a patch of dry land remained above the flood. Scattered wreckage from the collapsed building had formed a makeshift path, leading up to solid ground. If they could jump to it, they would escape the danger before the electricity spread. But if they were even a second too late... Zzt! Another violent spark erupted, a terrifying warning of what was coming. David clenched his jaw. They had to jump. He turned to Ranger. The dog panted heavily, drenched fur clinging to his body, but his eyes blazed with determination. He knew this was life or death. David planted his hands down, pulling Ranger close to his chest. Hold on tight, buddy. Ranger didn't resist. He trusted David completely. David stepped back, preparing to leap. The power line creaked, its base snapping under pressure. They had 3 seconds. Zzz! 2 seconds. David sucked in one final breath and jumped. The world slowed to a crawl. David felt every raindrop slamming against his skin, every gust of wind screaming past his ears. Ranger curled his body, his legs stretching out, bracing for impact. The distance was too far, but they had no other choice. Crash! They landed hard, tumbling onto the rubble. Wood splintered, concrete cracked beneath their weight, but they kept rolling, towards solid ground. David pressed his hands down, feeling the firm, unyielding earth beneath him. They made it! A split second. From death's as the very moment they hit the ground, boom! The power line collapsed into the flood, unleashing a blinding explosion, sparks erupting in every direction as electricity surged through the water. 1 second slower, and they would have been incinerated instantly. David lay on his back, his heart pounding wildly against his ribs. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest burning from exhaustion. Beside him, Ranger sprawled out, motionless for a moment. Then, he lifted his head, his eyes locked onto David, filled with concern. David let out a weak chuckle, lifting a trembling hand to scratch behind Ranger's soaked ears. "You okay, buddy?" Ranger whimpered softly, his tail twitching just slightly, a small but undeniable sign. He was alive. They had cheated death, but they were completely drained. A glimmer of hope somewhere above. A faint sound cut through the roaring winds and the Seine flood's deafening chaos. David's eyes fluttered open, his ears picking up something distant but unmistakable. At first, he thought he was imagining it. Engines, voices shouting, and then, a beam of light pierced through the destruction. Through the blinding sheets of rain, a rescue boat was approaching. Its floodlights cut through the murky water, scanning over the debris and wreckage. "We've got survivors!" A voice boomed through the storm, carrying over the crashing waves. David blinked, lifting his head. Silhouettes moved quickly aboard the boat, preparing to get closer, and leading the charge. Logan Carter. "David, hold on! We're coming for you!" David managed a weak smile. They had made it. The boat pressed forward, navigating toward the patch of land where David and Ranger clung to survival. The water was still violent, but Logan and the rescue team didn't hesitate. Crash! A piece of metal drifted past, nearly slicing through their path. Without waiting, Logan jumped down, wading through the raging current to reach them. David felt his body weigh heavier, exhaustion dragging him down. But he still forced himself to stand. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. Logan grabbed his arm, gripping tightly. David clasped onto him, and together, they heaved him up onto the deck of the boat. But there was something more important. "Ranger! Get Ranger up!" David shouted, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Logan didn't hesitate. He turned just in time to catch Ranger's collar as the dog leaped from the flooded land. Crash! A massive wave slammed into the boat, nearly knocking Logan off balance, but he held on. With one last mighty pull, he hauled Ranger up onto the deck. They were safe. They couldn't believe they had survived. David collapsed onto the boat's deck, his breath ragged, his entire body numb with exhaustion. He lifted his head. Looking around, the rain was still falling. The floodwaters still raged. The wreckage of Clearwater drifted helplessly across the water. Everything he had ever known, now unrecognizable. But he and Ranger were still alive. They had actually survived. David lowered his gaze, his trembling hand reaching out, resting on Ranger's soaked back. The dog shivered slightly, his breath heavy, but his eyes stayed open. Still fierce, still unwavering, Ranger inched closer, then gently laid his head against David's chest. A slow exhale, a final breath of relief. David swallowed hard, feeling Ranger's warmth against him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, tears silently streamed down his face. They had made it back from the dead. They still had each other. A new day sunlight spilled gently through the hospital window. David opened his eyes, the familiar scent of antiseptic filling his lungs. The steady beeping of the heart monitor echoed softly beside him. He had survived. The memories of the storm, the raging flood, the sharp pain in his skull. They were all still there. But above everything, one image remained seared into his heart. Ranger fighting through the flood, using every last ounce of strength to pull him from the water. A silent reunion. David turned his head, and immediately, he saw him. Ranger. Dog was curled up beside his bed, his breathing slow and steady, but his ears remained perked, as if he had never stopped watching over him. David stared down at him, his chest tightening. Ranger's fur was still damp, still carrying traces of mud from the storm, but his eyes, sharp, loyal, unwavering, just like the first day they met. David slowly reached out, his fingers grazing over Ranger's head. The dog stirred slightly, taking a deep breath, then lifted one paw and placed it gently on David's hand, as if making sure he was really still there. David let out a weak chuckle. No words were needed. They both understood. More than just a dog. He was family. For years, David had believed he was alone. He had returned from war carrying scars that ran deeper than his skin. Ranger was the only one who stayed, never left. Never. Judged. And now, David finally understood something he had always overlooked. Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was family. He had fought to save him, risked everything just to stay by his side. And David knew one thing for certain. He would never leave Ranger behind. David leaned down, his voice soft but full of emotion as he whispered into Ranger's ear. "We made it, buddy." David and Ranger's story was more than a battle against nature. It was a testament to loyalty, resilience, and the unconditional love between humans and animals. They are not just pets. They are friends. They are family. They love us, no matter what. Ranger never abandoned David, and David would never abandon Ranger. Just like Ranger, millions of dogs out there are waiting for someone to love them the same way. If this story touched your heart, share it and subscribe to Dog Stories to never miss another emotional journey. Support animal rescue organizations, the unsung heroes working to give loyal dogs like Ranger a second chance at life. And if you've ever had a four-legged friend by your side, give them the love they deserve. Because sometimes, family isn't just blood. It's the ones who stand by us through the darkest moments of our lives. Have you ever experienced a powerful moment with your pet? Share your story in the comments below.